Welcome once again to Off the Shelf, Books on Tour. I'm Veronica Andrews, your host. I don't say this all the time. This is a very interesting book. The Island of Worthy Boys. It's a novel, but it's a historically correct novel 99% of the time.
Sure.
By Connie Mayo. Thank you for bringing this to us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, I love the title, and of all that it entails, how did you come up with this title?
Well, I wanted to have a word that was sort of an old-fashioned word to match the fact that it's historical fiction. And I found there's actually a phrase that I couldn't go back and find exactly who said this, but sort of a very old-fashioned phrase about people who need assistance, which was the vicious and the worthy poor. So they really, back then, they really liked to delineate between who was deserving of aid and who was not. And so I wanted to use that in the title. And this was a school on an island where these boys were selected and they were deemed worthy.
In the time frame for the story, the school's been in place since 1832.
Mm-hmm.
In the time frame of the story, the early 1900s?
So 1889. It all sort of takes place within 4 months of 1889.
Okay. So that's when street urchins, which the boys were, two unrelated rapscallions, ragamuffins, that's what they were called at the time. More often than not, fathers were gone for multiple reasons, and single mothers were doing their best to bring it on, and they got into mischief.
Yes.
And mayhem. And how did you research that? Where did you find out what their life was before the school?
Well, there was a big homeless, unsupervised children problem in all of the urban centers at this point. New York had an enormous problem, and Boston did as well. And they, there were, I think in New York, there were estimated to be over 20,000 orphaned homeless children at the turn of the century. And this was a lot because people died very quickly of contagious diseases that would sort of, rip through the tenement, and you could have somebody who had a parent one week and they have no parent next week, and there were no social services to really pick up and somebody to come in and say, oh, you need a foster care placement, and they just sort of went out into the street. So there was a lot of information about these kids and how they just scratched by, and a lot of them would team up in gangs so that they could sort of, the power of numbers behind them, they could more effectively steal food and find shelter. But in The Island of Worthy Boys, the main character is sort of, he's not really a group player, and so he has to really fend for himself, and so his life is even harder.
But that again is a time frame that old people would remember, but young people are not going to understand because all we hear now is homeless grown-ups.
Right, and there is a problem with homeless families, but we really don't have a problem in our urban centers with homeless, unsupervised children, because we do have social services, we do have foster care, we have DSS, we have supports in place that really are pretty effective at least identifying these kids and making sure that they're not on their own.
But in finding their way by the grace of God, through an angel whose wings were a little bit tattered, they wound up at what most people in the New England area know as Farm and Trade School, Thompson's Island Farm and Trade School. A lot of times it's referred to as a reform school, which it may have been at some time in history, but not for long.
Yeah, I mean, I originally thought that it was a reform school.
Most people do.
And so when I originally heard about it, I was thinking of a much darker novel. I was thinking of sort of, like a Oliver Twist, Escape from Alcatraz, Lord of the Flies kind of thing. But then when I researched the school, it turned out that for most of its duration, it was actually sort of a good place that you could end up. And that was not true of all the institutions that were available to kids at that time. And the book references the actual reform school in the area, which is up in Westboro, and that evidently was very Dickensian and really a terrible place where, and in the book I talk about some of the things that went on there, and they really, all those are very true. These sort of, diet of bread and water and solitary confinement, and this is for young boys. So it was really, that was hard research to do.
Well, I like the word worthy because that sort of debunks everything else. And they had to be worthy. They had to show some intelligence, some drive and desire to better themselves and learn a trade, be it farming, printing, or whatever. And if DSS had gotten involved, those two boys would not have been allowed to stay together.
Right. So they have a con that they develop so that they can stay together. And so when they form a friendship, it's very important that they keep the ruse up that they are brothers, because that allows them not to be separated.
And while I'm sure there are today kids who have to grow up too fast and would know how to pull off a con, I'm not sure the majority of young people today would have the guts to give it a try.
Right. Well, they were desperate.
The survival instinct kicked in.
Yeah, they had to do a lot more sort of mature thinking than boys of their age today are forced to do. And that's not necessarily a good thing. That they had to do that.
Be afraid of the water and get on a boat to go to school.
Right. Right.
And that had to be frightening in itself. But the pleasure of a clean bed, a pillow, 3 meals a day. Many of the boys that were there, and especially these two, they had never known that.
Right. So it was a real treat for them to be able to have things that I think a lot of us take for granted today.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Bradley, who was the superintendent, I loved his vantage point. He saw everything. He let some things take care of themselves, but he knew just when to step in. He let them learn by doing and learning their own mistakes. And some very prestigious people attended Thompson's. If you're from the New England area, Big Brother Bob Emery was almost as famous in my childhood as Rex Traylor was in the next century and a half. And he was a student at Thompson's, as was Edward Rose Snow. And I often wonder if being off Boston Light didn't start him love of the lighthouse and being the flying Santa. And they went on to live the values that they were taught at Thompson's, which benefited not only themselves and their family, but their entire community. So it was a very good investment to make in worthy boys.
Yeah. Well, I was put in contact with an alumnus of the school he's now 90 years old. He remembers sharp as a tack, remembers everything about when he was 12 and 13, 14. He was sort of my consultant on this book, and we emailed back and forth for years, literally, while I was writing this. And he really feels that the school set him on the right path, so that he was able, that he learned discipline and work ethic, and that he was able to go on and have a very successful career and support his family, and that he's not entirely sure exactly how it would have gone had he not ended up in this place and found sort of the discipline that he learned there.
And I'll bet you he wasn't a rapscallion.
He was not.
A street urchin. Having had family members attend Thompson's, they were worth the investment. They didn't quite fit in the community. In one of the instances, he was born left-handed, and the public school tied his hand behind his back, which they did then, because you're supposed to be a right-handed person. That's all. At Thompson's, oh, you're a lefty? Here. They were allowed to be who they were born to be. And they were given life values, and I can attest to it, that served them well throughout their life and their family, friend, and communities, and still giving to this day. I took him back for his 50th birthday, and they put him in a golf cart and rode him all around the island and showed him all the things that he remembered, some of the buildings still standing. And they got to the museum where they had all the artifacts and everything, but they didn't know what they were for. And he got to tell them that was part of the printing press. That's what we made soap with. You know, so his knowledge increased their appreciation of him. And then they gave him 2 great big lobsters just to impress him and ask him to come back. The picture on the front was given to you by the gentleman that you worked with?
No, the picture on the front I found, so the archives for this school are housed at UMass Boston, and so I was going through these dusty boxes, and I found this picture, which was not one, they've scanned some of them online, but this was not one that was available online, and I flipped it over and it said 1890 on the back. So this is actually a picture of the school and 2 boys that went there. Originally there were 6 boys in the photograph in the art department, and my publisher sort of photoshopped 4 of them out and left 2. And so that's an actual picture that's very time appropriate.
Yeah, and it almost matches personality, physique, hair color, attitude.
Yeah, so that was sort of unintentional because I didn't know they were going to Photoshop these out, and I actually wrote the characters of Charles and Aidan, who in description look a lot like these guys, but I wrote them before I ever saw the photograph, so it's sort of weird that it turned out that way.
I think it's cool.
So.
But it took you 20 years to write it, from inception to print.
It took me 20 years to start writing it. Because I really don't know how anybody wrote historical fiction prior to the internet, because the amount of research that you have to do is really staggering. And it was so staggering that when I first thought of writing this book 20 years ago, and there was no internet, and I was a young person with a lot to do, I said, forget it. You know, that's not how I'm going to spend time at the library with the card catalog. And then 20 years later, everything had changed, and it really allowed me to do so much research online.
But it's so historically correct. How does it get novel? If you hadn't been so historically succinct, would it have been fiction?
I'm not sure. I mean, I get a lot of pleasure out of getting the smallest detail, correct. And I think that's a common thread with historical writers, is you just start loving. Yeah, when you start loving.
What is an egg cream?
Right, you just start loving the details. And I would, I would get so stuck on these things. There's a section in here where they come into the apartment of a prostitute, and I'm writing this scene, and I thought, would she wear a corset? Like, did prostitutes wear corsets? Proper women did, I certainly knew. So I had to stop right there and open a new tab and Google this, and an hour later I sort of concluded that she probably would be wearing a corset, and then I could continue writing the scene. But I just love that process, to the point that I will stop writing and just go off and research
as a
something.
reader, I kept on reading egg cream, and I've heard it all my life, but I never knew what it was. So I got out of it and started all over again, because I'm not as proficient as you are. And an egg cream is chocolate, salsa, and milk. And the froth becomes apparently very creamy. But we still can't figure out where egg comes from.
Yeah, that's lost to history, I think.
But,
I did research that. I could not determine where the egg came from.
They were very popular. Nicola at the marble top, real live soda fountain. So when you take the time and effort to research the writing, I, as a reader, appreciate the interpretation that you find, but you leave a couple for me to look up on my own. And that's not a bad thing. The quest for knowledge is extra special important.
Well, I think also as a historical writer, you have to guard against something that's been called, information dump, because you come up with a lot of information and then you want to share it. But if you're just sharing it as a sort of list of facts, or sort of being a smarty pants and telling people something that doesn't actually have to do with the narrative, it's annoying. And I've read pieces of historical fiction that do that. So I really try to sort of strike a balance between sort of giving you information, but not giving you so much that I'm lecturing you about history.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Did anybody at Thompson's now read it?
Yes, and I've been contacted by some alumni.
Good.
And some really mostly families of alumni, and that was something really unexpected and great about writing this book. So after it came out, through my website, several people contacted me and said that they were the daughter, the son, the nephew, whatever, of somebody who went to Thompson's, and usually that person is now deceased in these emails, and they've said, That's not a time of life that my relative talked about, and I always assumed that it was maybe they didn't talk about it because it wasn't so good. But reading your book made me feel like maybe it wasn't so bad, and it's given me comfort. And when I've received these emails, and it makes me feel so good. I mean, it was certainly not the purpose of writing this book, but the fact that it actually just gave somebody comfort about what might have happened to their relative has been really amazing.
I've heard the story of they grew cantaloupe. And they had to load the wagon with cantaloupe. And as they were going back to the storage to throw them off the wagon. And then, as you said, you had to work 2 hours and go to school 2 hours, and then you had time of your own. Well, when time of your own came about, you went back and attacked all the ones that you threw off the wagon on the way to the barn, which is very boyish.
Yeah.
And there were bullies, and there were smart alecks. And they had to tactically, strategically figure out how to, and we have a bully situation today that I find is absolutely unreal. And I personally think they're going at it wrong. I think these kids who sized it up and figured it out, and you sneak up on them and beat them at their own game.
You're old school, you can tell.
Well, I've never been bullied. I think that's a better weapon in preparation than trying to tell the bully to stop it.
Yeah. Well, I had to think, when all the boys are together on the island, I really wanted to think about, how can I sort of represent a cross-section of boys? What would boys, be like? And there's some that are tough and some that are not, and some that are quiet and some that are loudmouths. And so I tried to get a good mix in there. And that was actually a lot of fun writing about the boys and the dialogue between them.
Some of them were the sons of aristocrats who weren't buckling down. And they were sent, as many kids were sent in the army, to learn about life, to, try it on your own and take that chip off your shoulder.
Yeah.
And for the most part, they carried the chip with them until somebody there was smart enough to realize that they were lonely. And that's why they were so mean and so hateful. As long as they were making somebody else miserable, they were worse off than the guy that was doing it.
Yeah.
But slowly but surely, most of them learned what the values were to be taught. And I think it comes from the top down. And the fact that Mr. Bradley was a gentleman and that he led by example rather than by shouting or rules and regulations. They knew he was always watching.
Right. So I think he's a very sympathetic character, and he, of course, was the real superintendent for many years at the school. And I was a little nervous. I did as much research as I could on him, and he did seem like a very decent guy. And so I wrote him as a decent guy. And after the book was published, I got nervous that, well, what if he wasn't? I tried to find his relatives, and the trail went cold, and I wasn't able to do that. And I thought, what if he really wasn't a great guy? And one of the people who contacted me, their father graduated in the class of 1922, which is the year that Bradley died. And he worked at the island as superintendent up until he died. And I said, do you think he was a good guy? I was very nervous because if I heard the wrong thing, I was going to be very upset. And he said, yes, according to what my dad said, he really was a decent guy. And I was hugely relieved that...
And Mrs. Bradley was more like me.
Mrs. Bradley, anything about her, I believe, has been lost to history because a lot of times history doesn't really record the supporting woman in that role.
But she would have had to have been.
Well, I wanted to make her sort of a foil for him. She had to be different for him. They were sort of designed in my book, to be sort of yin and yang, where he's a little more flexible and she's a little more rigid, and sort of she keeps the ship running and so forth.
Well, that's what it's like in most homes, isn't it?
Somebody's got to do it.
The driver's seat isn't always that comfortable.
Right.
Now, you made reference to another book. What are you working on now?
So I love this era. My kids say that whenever you hear about the before the turn of the century, that's Mom's era. So the next book will also be in this era, but it will be set in New York City. And it will be set. So this book came about because I got interested in the institution of the Boston Farm School, and then I built the characters and the story around it because I wanted to write about the farm school. So now I want to write about the New York Cancer Hospital. which was the first cancer-only hospital in the country and the second in the world. And it opened in 1887, and it was at a time where cancer was actually thought to be contagious, and so cancer patients were being turned away from other hospitals. And it was just an interesting time for medicine and for surgery, which is because ether had just been sort of invented or discovered decades before. And I'm just interested in that, and I'm interested in medical ethics. And so my protagonist is, a young person who's pretty sure of the black and white of the world. And then when she starts working at the New York Cancer Hospital, she realizes that there's a lot of gray out there. There's a lot of morally ambiguous situations. And so she has quite an education working there.
And when will you have that done?
Oh boy, I'm researching now. It'll unfortunately be some years because I have a lot of other things going on. I'm not a full-time author. I have a part-time job, and so I'm trying to work it in. But I'm anxious to do it.
But you did such a good job on this one. Thank you.
Oh.
And in order to do something well, it has to be done right. And done right takes time.
Yeah. Well, you can't really rush research too much. It sort of comes at its own pace. There's a lot. And with this book, I did months and months of research before I ever started writing. And I think the research required for the next book will be even more onerous. And so it'll probably be even a longer period. So it's frustrating because, of course, I just want to start writing. But I don't have the detail that you so enjoyed in this book. I don't have it for the second book yet. So I'm working on it.
We're going to give you a minute to set yourself up and read us part of your writing.
Great.
And we will be back very shortly.
So just to set the scene here, the two characters, the boys who've come to the school and to the island under false pretenses, they've just come off the boat with the pilot, and the superintendent is in the office waiting for them, and he has a file of all this falsified information that he currently believes. And also you should know that the superintendent has a baby boy who's 18 months old at the time, who was born on the island. And this is from the point of view of the superintendent. As he heard their feet creak up the staircase, he willed himself to conjure an image of the life these brothers had left behind less than an hour ago. He didn't need to review their file to remember their sad and familiar story. Mother recently dead of an unspecified fever, father unknown to his sons, penniless. Before the boys could even get used to a world in which their mother no longer walked and breathed, they had left the only city they had ever known and found themselves in a place that, while a mere mile away, might as well be the Dakota Territory for all the resemblance it bore to the West End. Across this desk, he had seen the dirty faces of more than a dozen boys during their first hour on the island, and not one of them looked like he fully understood what was going on. And yet Bradley looked forward to these meetings with a feeling that, before coming to the island, he had only experienced kneeling in a pew. It was the feeling of a new beginning, the first day of a new life. This wave of feeling had come over him at an almost painful level when he first held Henry in his arms and smelled his infant head, a sensation so intense that he had to close his eyes until it receded. All his introductory meetings with the new boys since Henry's birth had brought back an unconscious scrap of memory from that day, and sometimes Bradley thought he could smell Henry's sweet baby scent when he was lecturing them, though more often the smell of the boys themselves would dominate the room. A knock at his door brought Bradley back to the present. Here he'd been reminiscing about his baby boy and had not quite finished his mental preparation for this meeting. Well, there was no help for it now. He smoothed his vest down, straightened the papers on his desk, and bid Fielding to enter with the new boys.
Well done. Well done. That says it all. You capture the anticipation of the kids coming into this new world. And isn't it nice that he wasn't a smart aleck? And he knew from their side of the desk. I sat on more principals' benches outside their office, and they didn't know what it was like to have to go to the principal's office. So I think, you picked a perfect time and place. Have you been there since the island has continued to educate young people as Outward Bound?
Yes, so I went there as part of research. That's always fun. So I took the ferry over, and the director there, Hilary Lucier, gave me a tour, put me in the golf cart, brought me around the island, and it was great. And one of the interesting things about Thompson's is it's really close to Boston. And when you get there, so in the book, when the boys arrive on the island, one of the things that one of the boys does, the first thing is he looks behind him to see, how close Boston is, and it's very close. And I did the same thing when I sort of got off the boat.
And yet people are astounded when I tell them my husband put a mason jar with money in it and swam to the mainland to get his cigarettes and swam back, only to be caught and get 15 demerits for doing it.
Right.
But it is close at low tide.
Yes, yes.
Very important.
Yeah, so I think he probably swam probably over to Quincy because it's very close at Quincy, and it's about a mile from Boston. But you can easily see all of the buildings in Boston, and it's amazing because you really feel like you're in a totally different kind of place, but you're really very close to Boston.
Yeah, and they had cattle and turkey and.
It's very agrarian,
and they took pretty much care of themselves. They made, all their own supplies. I thank you for writing it. Needless to say, we enjoyed it as a family. I think it does much for the Academy to sort of iron out the reform school, farm school, trade school. And I'd love to know that it's in the library at Thompson's.
I think it is. I sent them a book, so they requested one.
Well, I will be glad to put this one in my public library.
Great.
So anybody that would like to enjoy it as much as I have and learn, even with being as familiar with it as we were, we still learn things from your research. And I'm so glad you can read cursive writing. And it doesn't that frighten you that these children today, what are they going to do when they get to be our age and they want to do research? They're not going to be able to read.
I don't know.
I have my granddaughter hands me a birthday card and says, Nana, what does it say? Oh, that breaks my heart.
I never even thought of that. Now I have to go home and teach my kids how to read cursive.
Oh, my kids, I stopped having them when they decided to I think that's a valuable lesson. And I'm mumbling, thank you so much for being with us. Good book. Good read. Nice lady. Come back and finish us and tell us about the next one.
Oh, I'd love to.
Glad to have you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming. That's it for today.